I gave you an outline of the book of Hebrews, and if you'll keep this during the course of the study and refer to it, bring it to class, each class, and refer to it from time to time, it'll help guide you through this study. This study is going to be a rather in-depth study, and there are advantages and disadvantages to this type of study. Of course, the advantage is that you get into the what each verse teaches, and you more or less get it in the context. You get the background of it, and you get the flow of the information, and you learn really what it's all about. But the big disadvantage to this type of study is that it moves so slow that you may become kind of bewildered. You don't really know what this particular lesson, how it fits in. You become lost. And this outline, if you'll use it, will prevent that from happening to a great extent, because it'll kind of keep you on track, and it'll help you see how the very verses that we study fit into the overall pattern. So be sure and keep these outlines and refer to them during the course of the study. A little bit of background information before we get into the text. The Neil R. Lightfoot, in his commentary on Hebrews, in his preface wrote, he says, many people would dispute that Hebrews is in any sense contemporary. It deals in symbolism, and many of its symbols, like blood and priesthood and sacrifice, pertain to the Old Testament, to a long time ago when people worshiped God in this way. So much of its argumentation has to do with bygone eras, other dispensations, and it has the Levitical ritual that refers to that. So modern readers find that this is difficult, and too often they lay Hebrews aside as being boring and wearisome. Well, it's regrettable that some readers do this, because they don't get far enough into the text of the book to get past this sacrificial language and see that Hebrews is really the greatest piece of exhortation in all the Bible. And I don't think that is an overstatement at all. I have come to appreciate this book. In fact, it's become one of my favorite books, because chapter after chapter urges Christians to hang on to his faith, to be faithful, to stick with it, to see it through. Don't give up. Don't reach the point that you think it's not worth it, because this book shows beyond any shadow of a doubt that any trouble that we go to maintain our faith is merited. It's worth it. And the payback is going to be tremendous. So there are exhortations throughout this book for Christians to pay attention to the Word, to the ever-living and active Word that spoke not only in the past, but continues to speak even today in the present. In times of meaningless and drift, Hebrews, although outwardly archaic, is a modern book with a modern message, and one that we need in our life today. When you get to the point that you feel discouraged, that you're kind of wondering if it's all worth it, then Hebrews is the place to go. because this book shows that there's no sacrifice too great to remain a faithful Christian. Of all the precious writings that speak of the Christian faith, it's doubtful if any make a more distinctive contribution than the Epistle to the Hebrews. It describes in an elevated and an incomparable way the true nature and the value of Christian religion. For the author of Hebrews, Christianity is better than anything we've ever had before. It's the best of all possible religions. There are no religions that can even approach it. There are none that are similar to it. It is truly unique. And we're going to see this, that if a person is not a Christian, he just does not have any hope of going to heaven. That's how simple it is. And this book is going to show that beyond any shadow of a doubt. And I think we'll see that. Now, this outline that I've given you is from R.C.H. Lenski's commentary, almost verbatim. I've changed a little bit of it to make it a little bit more fluid, because Lenski wrote quite a few years back, but the outline is his, and we're going to follow this outline through our study. In fact, many of the comments that I'll make in class are straight out of Lenski's commentary. In fact, there were times when I wrote every word he wrote about some of the verses, because he is good, but he's a false teacher. So you got to be careful when you're following people like that to weed out the false doctrine and to just keep what's good. And that's what I've tried to do here, and I think that I have succeeded in doing that. Bertha?
I wanted to ask you about the authorship, because, one version says that Paul. Okay,
Yeah, we'll get into that.
We're going to get into that.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
We'll get to it.
Yeah, we'll get into that. Look at this first part of the outline here. The first main part, I think Lenski's got it divided up into 6 parts, I believe. But this is the first part, and it goes from chapter 1, verse 1, down to chapter 2, verse 4. This is the incarnate Son, supreme. And then he's incomparable in his supremacy, in his being, in his work, and in his position. That's the first 3 verses of this first chapter. And we'll have quite a bit to say about these first 3 verses, because they are loaded. And then verses 4 through 14, the incomparably supreme over all angels in his exaltation. So Jesus Christ is better than the angels, and we'll see that. And then in chapter 2, there's a warning. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? The first 4 verses of chapter 2. It asks that question, and then we're given an answer to it. So this is what we'll be studying in this first part, beginning with verse 1 down through verse 4 of chapter 2. So first, the incarnate Son. He's incomparably supreme in his being, work, and position. Now, before we actually get into the text, I want to make a few comments about what a great disadvantage we are to those who received this letter. The ones who received it knew some things we don't really know. we've kind of got to try to figure out. One of the things they knew is who wrote it. And Sister Bertha just asked about that. They knew who wrote it. Now, the Hebrew letter doesn't say who the author is, but the person who brought it to them and delivered it was able to tell them who wrote it and where it was written and where he came from and all the circumstances about that. He was able to inform them of that. So they knew all these things. We don't know those things for sure. We don't know who wrote it. We don't really know where he was when he wrote it, from where it was written. We don't really know who he sent the letter by. And another thing that's very important we don't know is we don't know where these people are that received the letter. We know they're Jews. We know that they are a group of believing Jews, a group of Jews who were converted to Christ, and a pretty large group. We know that because the way the letter reads, we can see that. So I think that's going to help us determine where they are and who they are. We know they're Jews. We know that they are in a certain geographical area. In other words, they're not scattered out like the Galatian brethren. The churches in Galatia were scattered out over a large geographical province, and there might have been 5 or 6 different congregations in that Galatia. There was Upper Galatia and Lower Galatia. Well, these Jews were in one certain locality in close proximity one with another. Now they probably met in more than one congregation because there was such a large number of them. But we'll talk about that a little bit later too when we find out, when we study who they are and where they are. So we are at a disadvantage because we don't know these things. They knew these things. So this gives them a big advantage over us in knowing all about this letter. But this letter is so important, its message is so clear that we don't have to know those things. It helps us to know them, but we don't have to know them in order to understand the message of Hebrews. The message of Hebrews is Jesus Christ and Christianity is better than anything God has ever given man. It's better. The word better is used. It's a key word in the book. It's used over and over and over. And I'll tell you a little bit later exactly how many times it's used in the King James Version. So, there are some things that this book says that helps us to decide who may have written it. And we're going to talk about the author now. Luke recorded in Acts 23 and verse 11. He recorded a promise that the Lord made to the Apostle Paul. In Acts 23, Paul had been arrested. In fact, the Roman contingent in Jerusalem saved his life because the Jews that had him were about to tear him to pieces. And the chief in charge of the Roman soldiers sent a group of his soldiers down there to rescue Paul, and they rescued him. And Paul spoke to them, and he spoke to them in the Hebrew tongue, and they listened to him very attentively until he said the word Gentiles. When he said the word Gentiles, they went crazy. And they grabbed him and were going to pull him and tear him apart again, and he had to be rescued again. So after this, in Acts 23 and verse 11, Luke, who wrote Acts, said that in the night following, the Lord stood by Paul, and he said, "Be of good cheer, Paul, for as thou hast testified of me in Jerusalem, so must thou bear witness also at Rome." So what is the Lord doing here? He's telling Paul, just like you testified of me here in Jerusalem. Well, when did Paul do that? Well, you read that sermon that he preached to the Jews. And it was the Jews he was preaching to. And they give close attention. He was speaking to them in the Hebrew tongue until he came to the word Gentiles. And then they stopped their ears and ran up on him and were going to kill him. Because they had thought that he had defiled the temple, had taken a Gentile in the temple, and they were just in an uproar. And so the Roman centurion had to rescue Paul a second time. So that night, the Lord appeared to Paul in this vision and told him not to worry. Just like you've testified of me in Jerusalem, you're going to testify of me in Rome. So it's very important, because it tells us that Paul was going to testify about Jesus Christ in Rome just like he did in Jerusalem. Now, to whom did he testify in Jerusalem?
To the Jews.
Huh?
He testified to the Jews.
To the Jews. Well, if he's going to testify in Rome just like he did in Jerusalem, who's he going to testify to in Rome? The Jews. So this is a very key verse. Acts 23:11 is very key to helping us find out who these people are that the book of Hebrews is written to. Now, we find in Acts 28:23 that the Jewish leaders in Rome met with Paul when he got there. You remember, why did Paul go to Rome?
Because he appealed to Caesar.
Yeah, he had appealed to Caesar.
They had to take him.
And where was Caesar? In Rome. So Paul had to be sent to Rome. Well, he was in prison 2 years in Caesarea, and then finally he was sent to Rome. On the way he had a shipwreck and got snake bit, but he finally got to Rome, and then he was in Rome a prisoner for 2 years. So that's 4 years he's a prisoner because of this episode here. But the last 2 years he was in Rome testifying to Jews, fulfilling that prophecy that Christ had promised him, that he would testify in Rome just like he did in Jerusalem. Now, what kind of success did he have in Rome? Well, look at Acts 28:24. Luke says, "And some believed the things which were spoken, and some believed not." So, he didn't tell us any numbers. He just said some believed and some didn't believe. Now, here's what we know about the Jews in Rome. We know this from secular history. There were 7 synagogues in Rome. 7 synagogues. Which tells us that there were quite a few Jews in Rome. Because you don't have a synagogue unless you've got, I think it's at least 60 people. And then you can have a synagogue. So they had 7 synagogues in Rome, probably in different areas of the city, but probably relatively close, because the Jews kind of lived together. They chummed together. They worked together. And this is the way the Jews did. When they went into a community, they kind of stayed together. What's the advantage of that? Fellowship. Yeah, being together, giving one another encouragement and protection. Because the Jews were persecuted people in most places that they went. In fact, they'd been run out of Rome one time, but now they were back in. And this was in the days of Nero, when Nero was there. So there were 7 synagogues there, and if about half of them become Christians during this 2-year period, it's safe to assume that at least 3 of those synagogues became houses of worship for Christians, because those people were converted to Christ. So we're beginning to see that there's quite a large number, a large group of Jewish Christians in Rome. Well, when was Paul a prisoner in Rome? Well, he got there in 60 and he stayed till 62 as a prisoner. 62 he was released. And when he was released, we know that he planned to go to Spain. And it looks like he probably fulfilled that. So he probably went to Spain. He left Spain after he did his work in Spain. He come back through Crete, left Titus in Crete, come on into Macedonia, left Timothy at Ephesus, and he was rearrested up in Macedonia the second time. This time he wrote 2 Timothy, and that's when he told him, hurry and try to come before winter and bring the coat and the books that I left in Troas. So we've got these little tidbits of information. Now we don't know if Timothy got there before Paul was martyred, but we do know that that time Paul was martyred. He was decapitated.
What year was that? You know?
That was probably 68. Probably. We don't know for sure. It may have been earlier because Nero burnt Rome in June of 64. And after a few months, he was blamed for doing it. Well, Nero didn't actually set the fire. You know, he was the emperor. If he burnt Rome, how would he have done it? Yeah, he would have had somebody do it. In fact, he was out of Rome when it happened. But if you're going to burn Rome, would you be in the city?
History goes that he played the fiddle.
Yeah, well, he come back. It burnt for 7 days. But he come back. And but you see why he was blamed is Nero wanted to build the big circus area, the racetrack, and for the horse races and all that, and he wanted to build that, and there were houses there. In order to build it, he would have had to tear down those houses. Well, what's a better way of tearing something down than just set it afire? And those were wooden huts built, you know, just right next to one another. You set one on fire and they're going to all go up like a bunch of matches, and that's what happened. It burnt for 7 days. There was, I forget how many regions of the city burned. The city, I think, had 7 or 8 regions, and 4 or 5 of them burnt flat up. And but later on, Nero got blamed for it. Well, the way he deflected the blame is he blamed it on the Christians. Well, see, this was 64. Now, these Jewish Christians, the Romans didn't even know that they were Christians, because to the Romans, the Jews were Jews. And they knew that the Jews they had their own religion. In fact, Rome gave them special laws to allow them to worship according to the Mosaical law. And in the Romans' eyes, the Jews weren't Christians. But it happened so fast, they became Christians so quickly, and only about half of them became Christians. The rest of them were still Jews, that the Romans still thought of the Jews as Jews. So when the Romans blamed the Christians, guess who got the blame? The congregations that Paul wrote to. Paul wrote Romans, the book of Romans, in 57. Well, see, here we're down to 64, 65, almost 10 years later. Well, Paul wrote Romans to the other group of Christians there, who we don't know how that congregation got started, because there never had been an apostle there. Paul wrote them, and he says, I want to come visit you. And we know how that developed. And finally, these are the ones, when Nero blamed the Christians for setting fire to Rome, those are the ones who got blamed. And they were put to death by the thousands. Nero even made human torches out of some of them and lit them on poles and burned them in his gardens at night, and threw parties while those Christians' bodies burnt, lighting his gardens. They were killed every conceivable way that you can think of. In fact, it went on to such an extent that the population even began to feel sorry for the Christians because of the way they were being put to death. Well, you might say, well, how could Nero blame the Christians and get by with it anyway? Well, let's look at a little bit of the background. What made this possible? In the eyes of the Roman citizen, a true Christian was a bad person. Number one, he was an atheist as far as they were concerned, because a true Christian would not worship the Roman gods. He would not drink an oblation to the Roman gods. He would not sacrifice to the Roman gods. He would not bow to Caesar. He was counted as an atheist and as a traitor, disloyal to the empire, an enemy of the state because of these things. He didn't attend the games. He was accused of incest because Christians had sexual relations with brothers and sisters. They called one another brothers and sisters and had sexual relations with each other. They were cannibalistic. They ate the body and the blood of their Savior. So they were accused of cannibals. They were accused of treason because they met in secret. Nobody knew what they were actually doing. They met in the catacombs. Well, why did they meet in secret? Yeah, they were hunted. They were hunted. They had to meet in secret to save their life. But all of these things in the eyes of the Roman citizen made these Christians enemies. And when Nero blamed them, the general population was ready to take vengeance on them. And that's what happened beginning in 64, late 64. He burned Rome in June. Well, the persecution against the Christians really didn't get started until late that year and into the next year or two. So 65 and 66, this persecution against the Christians was in Rome at its peak. It's when Peter was killed. And it may have been when Paul was killed too, Bertha. But I'm kind of thinking Paul may have been killed in 68 because he was in Spain and coming around Crete back into Macedonia and up into Ephesus, and then he got rearrested. So I don't know. We don't know for sure when Paul was martyred. But it was after 66, probably around 68.
Aren't we seeing a lot of that today? Just like, they go into that Baptist church building and start shooting up people. They represent someone worshiping God, whether they're doing it right or not, especially to a deranged person. And but then when that truck driver took that truck and went through the streets of New York, found out all those people and was saying, God is good or something like that. That's what they are doing, is trying to wipe out Christianity.
Oh, sure it is.
Terrorists, it's all aimed at people, Americans in general, that's
supposed
to be serving God.
Sharia law, which is a very conservative form of Islam, teaches that if you're not an Islamist, you're an infidel.
Right.
You're either that or you're not. Well, I could see them thinking, well, we know. Jesus says you're either for me or against me. You know, you can't straddle the fence. And they take that too. But Jesus didn't kill those that were against him. He says, love your enemies. Do good to them that persecute you. But they're the right opposite, see. But you're right. It is a religious persecution. And that's all this is religious persecution. It's an ideology that should be unlawful because no one, not even God, forces people to worship him. And no one has the right to force someone to do anything religiously. It should all be done by free will. But anyway, I don't want to really get into the next point, which is there are some good reasons why the Apostle Paul could not have written Hebrews. But I think this group of people that Paul converted when he came to Rome as a prisoner are the group to whom the book was written. It was written to this group in Rome. And we'll see this, and just keep all this in mind that we talked about this, because we'll refer to this class here 4 or 5 times as we go through our study, because there are some things said later in the book that refers back to these things that we mentioned in our class tonight. So this would be a good place to stop, and we'll pick up with this Sunday morning, is why Paul, the Apostle Paul, could not have been the author of the book of Hebrews. And we'll talk about that, and then we'll get into the text of the lessons. Any final comment before we close class tonight? We still got a couple of minutes. Okay, we'll go ahead and stop there and pick up with that Sunday morning. Thank you very much for your participation.